So in this video, we're going to talk about Rona Munro's play, The Last Witch. So Munro is one of contemporary Scotland's greatest playwrights. She's absolutely incredible. And this play is about a woman named Janet Horne, who was the last woman executed in Scotland for the crime of witchcraft in 1727. So, I mean, this was quite late, right? The real sort of heights of the witch hunting craze in Europe, Northern Europe in particular, was the late 1500s into the 1600s. And by the time you get to the 1700s, things have really sort of fizzled out in terms of witch hunting. In part because a lot of the socio-cultural conditions that had led to the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries had changed. In part because the sort of rationalist values of the Enlightenment had spread much more widely across society by the early 18th century. And in part because Europe had experienced 2+ centuries of religiously motivated violence, both in terms of religious wars, but also in terms of persecutions like the Spanish Inquisition, which of course nobody expected, and the witch trials and things like this. And I think there was probably by the early 18th century sort of a general sense that things were not going well, right? That all of this sort of religious violence, religious persecution, religious murders, etc., was basically a bad way of running a civilization. And so people started to say, let's not do it. So I think there's sort of a confluence of factors. But Munro is interested in this character of Janet Horne, who was executed in Dornoch, which is in northern Scotland. And this play, The Last Witch, is part of a sort of larger genre of contemporary drama, fiction, film, etc., that seeks to reclaim the legacy of witches from the misogyny, often the racism, and the general sort of oppressive tendencies that have colored the history of witch accusations, witchcraft accusations, of sort of the gendered component of this, the social class component of this, etc., etc. So Janet Horne is quite a poor woman. One of the interesting things that Munro builds in is this really striking ambivalence about whether or not Janet Horne has any power. So we open with her wishing to be a crow. So it says here, this is the stage directions. Near Janet Horne's house, a midsummer afternoon. The house overlooks the hill behind and the shore below. It is a warm summer afternoon, a rare northern treat. Janet is standing soaking in the sun, her face turned up to the sky, muttering to herself. Helen, her daughter, enters. She watches her mother for a while. Helen says, "Mother?" Janet goes on muttering. "Mother, what are you doing?" Janet stops, looks at her daughter in exasperation. Janet says, "Why can't I be a crow?" And then Helen turns to this very sort of practical day-to-day issue of They have no peat with which to make a fire. They have no food to eat, etc., etc. So we get initially this sense of really this ambivalence around Janet Horne's power, because if she was actually a witch who actually had supernatural powers, whether they were compacted in league with the devil or not, because Janet does deny ever having seen the devil. She also lives in a Christian community. But there's also reason to believe her denial of that. If she genuinely had supernatural powers, it does seem like she could transform into a crow if that was what she wanted, but she seems unable to do it. We also have introduced the theme of their poverty, that Janet and Helen have a little bit of land on which their house is built, but they don't really have anything else, right? Like, to get fuel for their fire, Helen needs to go with someone else to get that fuel. They depend on basically the charity of their neighbors, and that charity seems to be driven, at least in part, by a fear of Janet's ability to curse. So Elspeth Begg, who's their neighbor, shows up shortly after her husband, Douglas Begg, because Douglas Begg basically shows up and he's like, Janet, if you do not take your curse off of my cows, if you do not, because his cows have gotten sick, if you do not take your curse off of my animals, then I will denounce you as a witch. Elspeth shows up and is basically like, hey, sorry about all this bother. Here's some oatcakes and cheese. If you've cursed our animals, could you please not do that? And Janet's like, yeah, I didn't mean to, but I'm just so powerful that maybe in my dream I cursed them, and even from my dream, the curse would take effect, right? So it's not clear, of course, that Janet has any power from any of these interactions. She continually asserts that she does. Helen, who seems to doubt her mother, continually asserts that she doesn't, that it's all just trickery. And indeed, in a later scene, Janet has both Helen and Elspeth drink out of a water jug and describes these sort of big succulent feasts and this party with this amazing music and all this stuff. And they have this sort of psychotropic experience in which, almost like in the movie Hook with Robin Williams, where the Lost Boys imagine a giant feast. It's that sort of thing, right? And Helen later tells the investigator, Captain David Ross, I couldn't remember his first name, that this wasn't magic. She just puts herbs in the water. So again, it's not clear whether Janet has any power or whether she's just clever enough that she can sort of capitalize on the fears of her neighbors and sort of existing socio-cultural system that aligns single women with witchcraft. But things start to go sideways when Captain David Ross shows up. He, along with the minister, Mr. Neal, are basically charged with investigating this complaint that Janet Horne is a witch. Ross, as Janet sort of reveals, she sort of gives his backstory in a way that does suggest that maybe she has some sort of powers. Ross was in a war as a child. And when I say child, I don't mean he wasn't like 5, he was like 14, 15, something like that. And in his terror at this battle, he sort of laid among the dead until he was sort of disturbed by these old women who would come onto the battlefield after a battle and like steal rings and things off of the corpses. And so he has this fear of witches because of this traumatic experience of these sort of old, ragged women scavenging among the dead. But he also seemingly has a sexual relationship with Janet. And so later on, after Janet has been arrested for witchcraft and she's being held in prison, basically being tortured by being deprived of sleep, she is able to sort of use her cleverness and her knowledge of human psychology to really sort of mess with him. Because as her physical condition deteriorates under this torture, basically she sort of mocks him and is like, yeah, you had sex with me. You had sex with this person that you now find so hideous, and you were really, really excited to do so. So there is, again, this feminist element to this of like, this inversion of the sexual power as conceptualized by patriarchy, in which men dominate women and men choose to have sex with women, right? This sort of idea, right? This sort of idea that in the heterosexual relationship, men inherently have the power. This play really sort of undermines that, right? Because it's not clear that either of them necessarily have power in their relationship. And for the most part, their relationship is that of investigator and accused, or torturer and tortured. But it's not clear that either of them objectively has the power in that relationship. It really depends on what we mean by power in any given moment. So that's all going on. At the same time, Janet's daughter Helen is going around doing her own thing. And Helen is a really interesting figure because her hands and her feet seem to be crippled in some way. Whether this is like severe arthritis, whether this is a deformity, it's not 100% clear. But like, she doesn't have fine motor skills in her hands, for instance. So that's a thing that keeps coming up. But she actually does a lot of the work that keeps herself and her mother alive. But there's also a point where Janet tells her and Elspeth how to summon the devil. Yeah, I don't remember where it is just off the top of my head. Apparently I didn't mark it in my script. Anyway, so she tells Helen and Elspeth how to summon the devil, and Helen goes and does it. She stands in the road and she calls to the devil and says, it's something like, I will have no master but you. And a character named Nick appears. He seems to appear out of nowhere, just off the side of the road. And there's ambiguity about whether or not Nick is the devil initially. Helen seems reluctant to accept this idea because he looks like a human being. But basically, Nick, he seems willing to offer Helen whatever she would like, as long as she asks for it. And Helen resists the temptation to ask for it until the very end. So she actually goes to the prison, and she confesses to being a witch. She tells Ross that her mother has no power, but that she, Helen, has summoned the devil, and she has the power. And the devil has told her that he does not know Janet's name, but that she, Helen, has all of the abilities that Helen claims to have. Helen then subsequently confesses in order to spare her daughter being burned at the stake. Helen herself is burned, and strikingly enough, Douglas Begg, who is the one who initially made this complaint, is the one who has to do it because he's the local locksmith, which apparently also makes you the jailer and executioner in this town. So that's a thing. And Douglas is not that keen on this because the standard procedure, as Ross lays it out, is that you put the witch in a barrel of tar, parade her through the streets to the place of execution, then you strangle her with a thin cord, and then light the tar on fire. Ross is not that keen on this because he doesn't, like, this is his neighbor, right? And so even though he has set this whole chain of events in motion with his complaint that Janet Horne is a witch, a thing for which he knew the penalty was death and being burned, he nonetheless is not that keen on it happening when it's going to happen. But Ross is basically like, this is your job. You're going to do it. And so Douglas Begg does put her in tar. He refuses to strangle her so that she would be burned alive. And upon learning this, Helen summons Nick and basically says, just make sure that my mother's death does not hurt her. And what we get at almost at the end, not quite the last scene, the penultimate scene, second to last, Nick has been hired by Ross to actually build and light this fire. And what it says here is, and then there's just a great flash of fire and smoke as all the tar ignites at once. Nothing is visible through the flame but Janet. She cries out in pain and terror. Then Nick steps through the flames to stand close beside her. He leans into her. Nick says, "I'm here, darling, I'm here. This is for your bonny daughter's sake." He takes out Helen's little silver knife and holds it high. Janet sees it. Janet says, "Oh, God bless you." He stabs her dead. The fire covers everything. So first off, I would love to see how that's staged, because to do that on a physical stage seems very, very tricky to me. But again, it is this sort of interesting ending that, while it doesn't sort of absolutely answer the question of whether or not Nick is the devil, the fact that he can walk through fire does seem to raise some concerns about his relative supernatural state. But again, one of the things I really like about this play, and about a lot of Munro's work that I've read, is that it is driven by these ambiguities.